Welcome to Learning Objective 6, How Nature and Nurture Affect Your Brain. So we'll begin with this concept of natural selection, which is the basis of evolution. As it says here, it's the idea that those who inherit characteristics that help them adapt to their particular environments have an advantage over those who do not. So those that like if you inherited something that makes it that gives you an advantage, something to adapt to your environment, then you're more likely to survive and to reproduce and then pass on those advantageous characteristics onto your offspring, and you would do so through your genes. So this is natural selection is what leads to evolution. The members of a species that are born with certain advantages, they tend to be more likely to survive, and they survive longer, so they're more likely to have children, and they typically, and if they live longer, they can have more children than others. And so those advantageous genes get passed on more than genes that, make it more likely that you might die at a young age or not, have any children. And then so this is it is genetics that are responsible for natural selection and for evolution. So genes, these what do I want to say here? Sorry. Okay, first of all, let me start before I get to the genes. Let me start with we have chromosomes inside each cell's nucleus. Remember when we looked at neurons, I mentioned that every cell has a nucleus that contains our genetic material, our DNA. Well, there are chromosomes inside each nucleus, and the chromosomes carry your genetics, your genes, and these genes are composed of DNA. They are the units of heredity, which partially determine an organism's characteristics. So genes carry, information that you inherit from your biological parents. Um, Humans have 46 chromosomes in each nucleus. You get 23 from each parent. A human receives these these chromosomes at conception. So a sperm meets and fertilizes an egg, and the sperm carries 23 chromosomes, and the egg carries, from your father, and the egg carries 23 chromosomes from your mother, and they meet and they form the first cell, which is known as a zygote, and it would have 46 chromosomes, 23 from each parent. So if you were to have a powerful enough microscope to look inside any of your cells, you would find that each cell has a nucleus, and inside the nucleus, there would be 46 chromosomes. Okay. Um, a couple of terms that we need to know here are genotype and phenotype. So the genotype refers to your specific genetic code, and that never changes. You have the same genetic code that you had when you were conceived, the moment you were conceived, because that set of 46 chromosomes that were in the initial ones in the initial cell of life. Um, Once again, 23 from your mother, 23 from your father. That cell ended up duplicating over and over again, and every time cells duplicate, from 1 to 2 to 4 cells to 8 cells to 16 cells, I mean, they make exact copies of those chromosomes and of your genes. So every cell of your body has the same set of genetic information, and it's always been the same, since you were conceived. That is your genotype, your genetic information, your genetic code. Your phenotype is your specific observable characteristics that result from your genetic code. Phenotype can also be affected by environment. So, I don't know, an example phenotype is that I have blue eyes. That's my eye color phenotype. I have blonde hair. That's my hair color phenotype. So it's just phenotype to refer to, physical characteristics like my eye color or hair color or my height. It could also, refer to, um, aspects of my personality and things like that. Um, but it's the result of your genetics. So we have these two different terms because, in some instances, two people might have the same phenotype, even though they have different genotypes. So, like, let's say there are two siblings that have the exact same color of brown eyes. Well, that would mean that they have identical phenotypes. But it may be that one of them has a blue-eyed gene from their father and a brown-eyed gene from their mother, and they ended up with brown eyes because brown eyes are dominant over blue eyes. And the other brown-eyed child has a brown-eyed gene from their father and a brown-eyed gene from their mother. So one of them has a brown-blue combination, one of them has a brown-brown combination, but they end up with the exact same color eyes, the exact same phenotype. So you can have different genotypes that result in the same observable characteristics. Okay. Um, Behavioral genetics studies the relative impact of nature, which refers to our genetic influence, and versus nurture, which refers to environmental influence. So it's looking at, for any trait, it looks at how much is that a result of genetics versus environment. And this would include things like mental activity or behaviors. Um, some traits are highly heritable, meaning that they're mainly caused by genetics. So just a simple example is your height. It's estimated that it is 70 to 80% caused by genetics. So, mainly caused by genetics. It's 70 to 80%. That means environment has some influence. If you don't have nutritious food, particularly when you're a baby and very young, you may not grow to your full height. There's other things that can stunt your height as well. Um, uh, for instance, growing up uh, and not feeling loved can actually make you end up being shorter. Okay, uh, the point is that it's highly heritable. Like, most of the time, you're going to end up at the height. Your height is going to be mainly determined by your genetics. Um, Other things are not very heritable. I'll give you an example. One example is religious affiliation. It's estimated to be about 0% heritable, meaning, like, you don't get your religious affiliation through your genetics. You get it through your environment, through nurture, through your upbringing and what you're taught, and what your parents believe, and the people that you look up to and things like that. So it's not something you're born with. Like I'm born with a blueprint kind of already for how tall I'm going to end up when I'm born, but I have no blueprint for what kind of religion I'm going to end up choosing or believing in. That's going to be determined after I'm born. It's not part of genetics. And instead of about 0%, because it's possible that it's like, maybe it's like 0.1 or 0.2% or something like that, but it's close to zero. So we know that you know genetics influence some traits greatly, other traits that not at all. And this is what behavioral genetics studies. You know, what they might look at things like intelligence. Is that mainly genetics, or is it mainly environment? Is it how you're raised and taught, or is it just the the chromosomes and genes you get? Like, and they study this for different traits, and it's an interesting area. Um, let's take a little bit of a look at how they do these studies, and we'll start by talking a little bit about. Oh, actually, backing up here, methods include twin studies and adoption studies. So let me talk a little bit about twins, and then I'll talk about twin studies. Um, Genes produce two types of twins, as you probably know: monozygotic or identical twins. They come from one sperm and one egg. Uh, what happens, just like any of us. I mean, you know, uh, we a sperm meets an egg, it produces a zygote, and that zygote usually is going to develop into a single individual. Well, sometimes um, a mistake in a sense, or there's a mutation or something. The normal process is that one cell is going to become two cells, become four cells, become eight cells, as this organism grows, as this um, um, new life grows. But in certain cases, they end up in, we're not really exactly sure why it happens, but that instead of staying as one organism, it splits into two. And you can see it in this first picture here. That zygote, one cell became two, and they were joined together, but then they split apart. And when they split apart, you end up with two identical cells. Remember that first zygote, that first one cell shown on the left, it duplicates itself exactly with the same genetic code. And then and normally they remain fused together, but sometimes they split apart, and so you have two identical zygotes, which are going to become identical twins. What's important about them is that they share 100% of their genes. They have these identical twins have the exact same genetic code as each other, um, and so this is important for behavioral genetic studies. The other types of twins are called dizygotic or fraternal twins, and in this case, this is two separate eggs that are fertilized by two separate sperms. So it's just it just happens that there are two eggs in the system at the same time, within the mother's fallopian tube, or um, and and this may happen for various reasons. I don't really want to get into them. I talk about it in my child class, but not in this class. But it's not normal. During a typical cycle, a woman releases one egg, per month, one ovum or egg, and it travels through along the fallopian tube. If there happens to be sperm, it may be fertilized, and conception may take place. But occasionally, under certain circumstances, there will be more than one egg, and so two different sperm can impregnate the two different eggs. Anyway, so when that happens, you get two different zygotes, and so you dizygotic or fraternal twins. They can be, you know, a boy and a girl. That's in this picture here. They're not going to look any more similar than typical siblings. They're not going to be any more alike than typical siblings, even though they are in the womb at the same time and born at the same time. They're no more closely related than any two siblings that may be born years apart. they share an average of 50% of their genetics, which is true of any siblings. So I have a brother and I have a sister, and so I share about 50% of my genes with each of them. So identical twins share 100% genes. They have identical genetics. Fraternal twins have a lot of genes in common, but a lot of genes that are not in common. So only about half their genes are similar. And this becomes important. Um, the twin studies, as it says here, they compare and contrast monozygotic twins, the identical twins, with dizygotic twins, also known as fraternal twins. Oh, by the way, I wanted to mention mono means one. So monozygotic just means one. It starts as one zygote, one cell. Dizygotic, di means two. So dizygotic just means they start as two separate cells. Okay. Anyway, so a twin study wants to look at, they compare the two sets of twins. Like they might be comparing the twins in the first picture versus twins in the second picture here. And they will have, lots of subjects. So they'll have a whole bunch of sets of identical twins, a whole bunch of sets of fraternal twins. And the question being studied is, are identical twins more similar on a trait than non-identical fraternal twins? If the identical twins are, all the sets of identical twins are really, really similar on some trait, then and the fraternal twins are often not similar on that trait, it means it's more likely caused by genetics. Okay, so like we can expect, for instance, that identical twins will have the same height because we know that it's mainly caused by genetics. Whereas the fraternal twins, they may end up being, very different in height, because they don't share all the same genetics. So when we see that, hey, the identical twins are really similar on this characteristic, and the fraternal twins aren't, that says, oh, it must be genetics that mainly causes that thing. I mean, it's a little bit more scientific than that, but that's basically the logic. If, however, the identical twins are no more similar on a trait than the fraternal twins, then it's probably that characteristic is caused by environment. So, identical twins are no more likely to have the same religious affiliation as fraternal twins because there's no genetics involved. Okay. Anyway, so that's kind of the basic logic of a twin study. Behavioral genetics also looks at adoption studies. One type compares the similarities between biological relatives and adoptive relatives. So, for example, let's say a baby is adopted right after birth. The question is, will it be more similar to its biological parents or its adoptive parents? So it's contrasting genetics versus environment, nature versus nurture. If genetics are really important for something, then that baby will grow up being more similar to its biological parents, even though they did nothing to raise the child. If environment's more important for a characteristic or a trait, then that child will grow up being more similar to the adoptive parents. Okay. Finally, another type of adoption study compares twins who have been raised together with twins who are raised apart in adoptive families. I'm not going to get into the specifics of that or the logic, but you can read more about that in the book. And you can read about these Jim twins that the book talks about as an example. I'll leave that to you to read on your own. And epigenetics is a new field in which researchers look at how closely environment affects gene expression. It turns out that certain environmental conditions can turn genes on or off. And this is what epigenetics really concentrates on. Once again, this is not something I'm going to go deeply into. I have included a video for you entitled "What is Epigenetics?" And so that will be available right after this one in the list for you to watch and learn more about epigenetics. Okay, plasticity refers to the nervous system's ability to change over time. This can include recovery from injury or just learning from experience. Remember in an earlier video, I talked about um, expert violin players being studied, and that their their brain changed because of all the years they'd spent using their left hand and left fingers to pluck the strings, over and over, hours and hours and hours, over the course of years. That the areas in their motor cortex and somatosensory cortex, the areas that corresponded to their left hand, actually became larger. So that's an example of plasticity, where the brain changed in response to learning from experience. These violinists spent a lot of time using their left fingers and left hand to pluck strings, and and this all of that experience caused the brain to devote more neural pathways um, to be available for that hand. And okay, so that would be an example of plasticity where you learn from experience. The brain changes in response to something that you do a lot in life. It can also change in response to an injury, and the brain can change to help you recover from an injury. When you recover from a brain injury, certain brain regions can sometimes take over the functions previously performed by the injured part of the brain. So let me give you an example. This is what's her name? Michelle Mack, shown in this picture here. And while she was in her mother's womb, Michelle suffered a stroke that destroyed her left hemisphere. And you can see it in the picture here. It's actually on the right side of the picture, the left hemisphere. It's that big black area is the missing part of her brain. You can see that it's almost completely half of her brain was destroyed. So she's missing most of one side of her brain. And so, obviously, that's a huge, humongous injury. It's not a typical injury. Anyway. So this was an example of what's called extreme plasticity. Over time, her right hemisphere took over the duties normally performed by the missing left hemisphere. This includes language production and moving the right side of her body. So I talked about that earlier, that most of us, we have our language center in the left hemisphere. And I talked about how our left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. Well, her right side took over these functions. And this was an example of plasticity. It's like a reorganization that goes on um, to allow an organism to continue to function. Um, anyways, and this happened to a surprising extent. Um, it really, it shocked um, the doctors and researchers involved in this case study, how much plasticity and brain reorganization took place here to develop a whole new, language center on the opposite side of the brain, and to rewire the brain so that so that her right side could control both sides of the body. Extreme example of plasticity. So that's what all it refers to. It's like the brain changes, and it can change once again in response to an injury, or it actually changes every day just in response to life experience. Every time you learn something new, um, or create a new memory, your brain changes very slightly in some way, and that's how we remember things, and that's how we learn new things, and that is the importance of plasticity. Okay, some more terms to know. Um, Neurogenesis refers to the production of new neurons. New neurons can be produced in some areas of the brain. For example, the hippocampus, where which is, remember, is responsible for helping us to form new memories. This was only discovered during the last 25 years. When I was first in school and taking psychology, what I was taught was that you're born with all the neurons you'll ever have, and that was very commonly known back when I was a student. People would say, "Oh, don't do drugs because you're destroying neurons and you can't get new ones." Because that was common knowledge, and so it's a pretty recent discovery that's happened during my lifetime that with new technology we were able to discover that yes, even in adulthood we can create new neurons within the brain, but it's only in a couple of areas. Um, okay, let's go on here. Um, when when one neuron activates another within the brain, like remember I talked about neurons that are communicating, that, and this is what I mean by activates. It sends one neuron sends signals to another neuron. When one neuron activates another, the connection between them grows stronger. And this is summarized by psychologist Donald Hebb's phrase. So his name's Donald Hebb, and he always used this phrase: "Neurons that fire together wire together." And this is basically how learning takes place. That as you do something, the more often you do something, the stronger the connections will form in your brain to support that activity. So it'll get easier for you, and you'll be able to do it faster over time because with stronger connections, the information can move more quickly. And just to give you an example, think about something like reading. And I don't know if you remember learning to read. I don't. But if you've ever been around a young child who's just learning to read, I mean, it's almost agonizing to have them read you like a storybook or something as they, struggle through each word. So like, they're looking at this title here, and they would probably have trouble with and then environment would just take them probably a minute to read. In, ver, on, men, and it's like it, it, it it's because it's a new activity, right? So they don't have established pathways. You're not born with pathways in the brain that support reading. So you form them as you learn. You start to form them, and once you start repeating the process through more and more practice, then the neurons that are firing together, that always kind of the sequence of neurons that fire to whenever you read, then they wire together, meaning that they strengthen, that connection becomes stronger and stronger. And that's why, like, at your age, you're a skilled reader. You had, however old you are, but you've had approximately 20 or more years of reading practice, and at your age, it's it's you have such strong connections that you don't even have to read letters anymore when you read a word. I mean, glance at any word on the screen and don't even try to read it. Just look at the word. As soon as you look at a word, if you were born an English speaker, at least if it's not a second language, you look at any of these words, and you don't have to sound out any letters. You just know what the word says. You know, even a long one, like look at the second word in the title. As soon as you looked at it, you knew it was environment. You didn't have to say environment, like you didn't have to sound out. A lot of times we don't even look at all the letters. Eye tracking studies show that we sometimes just look at part of a word and we know what it is. And so and this is because you have been reading for so many years, and like, you know, typically we read things every day, whether we're trying to or not. What I mean by that is I don't mean just read books or something. Even when you're driving, if you look at at stores or whatnot, well, there's Jim's fish fry. Like you just happen to glance over, you saw the words, they just go into your brain now. So you've been doing this for years, like seeing words over and over and over again, that you have such strong connections that have become wired together to support, you know, all the familiar words that you've read thousands of times during your life. The only time times that a skilled reader, um, you know, struggles is if you come across a brand new word that you've never seen before, or like somebody's name that you've never seen before. Like this happens to me. I always struggle with long names, and I have to sound them out, and I feel like I'm a beginner reader again because if you don't have the pathways, it is kind of like you're going back to sounding out a word. Um, and so this is this is, you know, connected to plasticity. Of course, it's plus I said, you know, plasticity is the brain changing as you learn. This is talking about how it's changing. These are the changes taking place. You're doing something, practicing over and over. You get stronger connections. They wire together, and that supports it becoming easier and easier the more you do it. Okay, the something that's kind of the opposite is neural pruning. Um, Neural pruning refers to the removal of connections in the brain that are not being used, and this actually strengthens the ones that are used more by getting rid of the ones that aren't being used. This mainly happens in late childhood, and it makes the brain faster and more efficient. Um, so you don't have, like, you know, these barely used connections that are slowing the system down. Okay, let's go on. And our final slide for this this learning objective in this chapter talks about brain reorganization. And I've already mentioned this term. This is connected to plasticity as well. Um, Sometimes entirely new connections develop between neurons. This new growth is a major factor in recovery from brain injury, like in the Michelle Mack case study that I talked about a couple of slides ago. That was an example of brain reorganization, where you get brand new connections between neurons developing um, to establish new functions. Like she would have had new connections form to, you know, to develop a new language center, for instance, on the right side of her brain. Um, the younger you are, the more likely your brain will reorganize following a brain injury. Remember, hers happened in the womb, so that's like, you know, basically as young as you can be for a brain injury. And this is why she showed, you know, an extreme plasticity case, was that she was so young when it happened. If she had lost half of her brain when she was 10 years old, she would have never recovered as well. Um, so it's, you know, every year older like makes that much difference. When you become an older adult like I am, if I was to have a brain injury, you know, I would never recover as much function as a child would. I would recover some, but, you know, with a lot of practice, I would still be able to do some brain reorganization, and but it would take a lot of work, and I would never recover like full function of what was lost. So, anyways, this is going to conclude our chapter 2 look at biology and psychology. We will look at consciousness in chapter 3 to finish up module 2.